Welcome to... I can't speak English, apparently. That's fine. I was gonna have a nice, fancy intro, but it's whatever. Welcome to Paper Cuts. We're doing the June issue of Astounding Stories this week. Probably not the whole thing, because I kinda am sick. I've been having the worst nausea for a good little bit, and, not to get a little too into detail, but I've been on and off the toilet too, so, I kinda feel like garbage. I didn't go to class today because of it, and but I'm stubborn, so we're reading. I don't know how long it's going to last, but we'll keep reading until my throat's like, please stop, I'm dying, or other things intrude. Anyway, let's get into the June issue, shall we? We're reading Out of the Dreadful Depths by C.D. Willard. Robert Thorpe reached languidly for a cigarette and with lazy fingers extracted a lighter from his pocket. "Be a sport," he repeated to the gray-haired man across the table. "Be a sport, Admiral, and send me across on a destroyer." "Never been on a destroyer, except in port. It'd be a new experience. I'd enjoy it a lot." In the palm-shaded veranda of the clubhouse in Manila, Admiral Struthers, of the United States Navy, regarded with undisguised disfavor the young man in the wicker chair. He looked at the deep chest and broad shoulders which even a loose white coat could not conceal, at the short wavy brown hair, and the slow, friendly smile on the face below. A likable chap, this Thorpe, but lazy. Just an idler, he'd concluded. Been playing around Manila for the last 2 months at least. Resting up, he'd said. And from what? The Admiral had questioned him. Admiral Struthers didn't like indolent young men, but it would have saved him money if he had really got an answer to his question and had learned just why and how Robert Thorpe had earned a vacation. "You on a destroyer?" he said, and the lips between his close-cut gray mustache twisted into a smile. "That'd be too rough an experience for you, I'm afraid, Thorpe. Destroyers pitch about quite a bit, you know." He included in his smile the destroyer captain and the young lady who'd completed their party. The young lady had a charming and saucy smile, and she knew it. She used it in reply to the Admiral's remark. "I've asked Mr. Thorpe to go to the Adelaide. We'll be leaving in another month, but Robert tells me he has other plans." "That's worse and worse. Your father's yacht is not even as steady as a destroyer. Now it's just a nice, comfortable liner." Robert Thorpe didn't miss the official glances of amusement, but his calm complacence was unruffled. No, I don't just fancy liners. Fact is, I've been thinking of sailing across to the States alone." The Admiral's smile increased to a short laugh. "I'd make a bet you wouldn't get 50 miles from Manila Harbor." The younger man crushed his cigarette slowly into the tray. "How much of a bet?" "What'll you bet I don't sail alone? From here to... where are you stationed? San Diego? From here to San Diego." "I'd bet $1,000 on that and take your money for Miss Eilaire's pet charity." Now there's an idea. He reached for a checkbook in his inner pocket and began to write. "In case I lose, I might be hard to find, so I'll just ask Miss Ellaire to hold this check for me. You can do the same." He handed the check to the girl. Winner gets his 1,000 back, Ruth. Loser's money goes to any little orphans you happen to fancy." "You're not serious." "Oh, sure. The bank will take that check seriously, I promise you. And I saw just the sloop I want for the trip. Had my eye on her for the past month." "But, Robert, you don't mean to risk your life on a foolish bet." Thorpe reached over to pat her tenderly upon the hand that held his check. "I'm glad you care," and there was an undertone of seriousness beneath his raillery. That's a good word, raillery. "But save your sympathy for the Admiral. The U.S. Navy can't bluff me." He rose more briskly from his chair. "Thorpe," he was thinking deeply, trying to recollect. "Thorpe, I have a book by someone of that name, Travel and Adventure, and knocking about the world. Young man, are you the Robert Thorpe?" Yes, if you wish to put it that way," agreed the other, as he waved lightly to the girl and moved away. "I must be running along, you see, and go get that boat. See you all in San Diego." The first rays of the sun touched with golden fingers the tops of the lazy swells of the Pacific. Here and there a wave broke to spray under the steady wind and became a shower of molten metal. And in the boat, whose sails caught now and then the touch of morning, Robert Thorpe stirred himself and rose sleepily to his feet. Out of the snug cabin at the first hint of day, he looked first at the compass and checked his course, and then made sure of the lashing about the helm. The steady trade winds had borne him on through the night, and he nodded with satisfaction as he prepared to lower his lights. He was reaching for a line as the little craft hung for an instant on the top of a wave. And in that instant his eyes caught a marking of white on the dim waters ahead. "Breakers!" he shouted aloud and leapt for the lashed wheel. He swung off to leeward and eased a bit on the main sheet, and then lashed the wheel again to hold on a new course. Again from a wave crest, he stared from under a sheltering hand. The breakers were there. The smooth swells were foaming, breaking in mid-ocean, where in his chart he knew showed water a mile deep. Beyond the white line was a three-master, her sails shivering in the breeze. The big sailing ship swung off on a new tack as he watched. Was she dodging those breakers? Then he stared in amazement, through the growing light at the unbroken swells where the white line had been. He rubbed his sleepy eyes with a savage hand and stared again. There were no breakers. The sea was an even expanse of heaving water. "I could swear I saw them," he told himself, but forgot this perplexing occurrence in the still more perplexing maneuvers of the sailing ship. This steady wind, for smooth handling, was all that such a craft could ask, yet here was this old-timer of the sea with a full spread of canvas booming and cracking as the ship jibed. She rolled far over as he watched, recovered, and tore off on a long sweeping circle. The one-man crew of the little sloop should have been preparing breakfast, as he had for many mornings past, but instead he swung his little craft into the wind and watched for near an hour the erratic rushes and shivering haltings of the larger ship. But long before this time had passed, Thorpe knew he was observing the aimless maneuvers of an unmanned vessel, and so he watched his chance for a closer inspection. The three-master Minnie R, from the dingy painting of the stern, hung quivering in the wind when he boarded her. There was a broken log line that swept down from the stern, and he caught this and made his own boat fast. Then, watching his chance, he drew close and went overboard, the line in his hand. "Like a native after coconuts," he told himself as he went up the side. But he made it and pulled himself over the rail as a ship drew off onto another tack. Thorpe looked quickly about the deserted deck. "Ahoy there!" he shouted. But the straining of rope and spars was his only answer. Canvas was whipping to ribbons. Who in the world is ringing my phone? Is this important? Oh. Canvas was whipping to ribbons. Sheets cracked their frayed ends like lashes as the boom swung wildly, but a few sails still held and caught the air. He was on the afterdeck, and he leapt first for the wheel that was kicking and whirling with a swing of the rudder. A glance at the canvas that still drew, and he set her on course with a few steadying pulls. There was rope lying about, and he lashed the wheel with a quick turn or two, and watched the ship steady down to a smooth slicing of the waves from the west. And only then did the man take time to quiet his panting breath and look about him in the unnatural quiet of this strangely deserted deck. He shouted again and walked to a companionway to repeat the hail, but only an echo, sounding hollowly from below, replied to break the vast silence. It was puzzling, inconceivable. Thorpe looked about him, to note the lifeboats snug and undisturbed in their places. There was no sign of an abandonment of the boat, but abandoned she was, as the silence told only too plainly. And Thorpe, as he went below, had an uncanny feeling of the crew's presence, as if they'd been there, walked where he'd walked, shouted and laughed, a brief hour or two before. The door of the captain's cabin was burst in, hanging drunkenly from one hinge. The logbook was open, and there were papers on a rude desk. The bunk was empty where the blankets had been thrown hurriedly aside. Thorpe could almost see the skipper of this mystery ship leaping frantically from his bed at some sudden call or commotion. A chair was smashed and broken, and the man who examined it curiously wiped from his hands a disgusting slime that was smeared stickily on the splintered fragments. There was a fetid stench within his nostrils, and he passed up further examination of the room. Forward in the That's a boat term that I have no idea how to say. It's FO'C''SLE. Forecastle. Okay. Thank Hylia. Forward in the One moment. I forgot to turn off the AC. There we go. That's much less noisy in here now. Forward in the forecastle, he felt again irresistibly the recent presence of the crew, and again he found silence and emptiness and a disorder that told of a fear-stricken flight. The odor that sickened and nauseated the exploring man was everywhere. He was glad to gain the freedom of the wind-swept deck and to rid his lungs of the vile breath within the vessel. He stood silent and bewildered. There was not a living soul aboard the ship, no sign of life. He started suddenly, and a moaning, whimpering cry came forward on the deck. Thorpe leapt across the disorder of tangled rope to race toward the bow, and he stopped short at sight of a battered cage. Again the groaning came to him. There was something that still lived on board the ill-fated ship. He drew closer to see a great huddled, furry mass that cowered and crouched in a corner of a cage. A huge ape, Thorpe concluded, and it moaned and whimpered absurdly like a human in abject fear. Had this been the terror that drove the men onto the sea? Had this ape escaped and menaced the officers? And the crew as well? Thorpe dismissed the thought he well knew was absurd. The stout wood bars of the cage were broken. It had been partially crushed, and the chain that held it to the deck was extended to its full length. Too much for me. Entirely too much for me. But I can't sail this old boat alone. I'll have to get out and let her drift. He removed completely one of the splintered bars from the broken cage. I've got to leave you, old fellow, he told the cowering animal, but I'll give you the run of the ship. He went below once more and came quickly back with the logbook and papers from the captain's room. He tied these in a tight wrapping of oilcloth from the galley and hung them at his belt. He took the wheel again and brought the cumbersome craft slowly into the wind. The bare mast of his own sloop was bobbing alongside as he went down the line and swam over to her. Fending off from the wallowing hulk, he cut the line, and his small craft slipped slowly astern, as the big vessel fell off in the wind and drew lumberingly away on its unguided course. She vanished into the clear-cut horizon before the watching man ceased staring and pricked a point upon his chart that he estimated was his position. And he watched vainly for some sign of life on the heaving waters as he set his sloop back on her easterly course. It was a sun-tanned young man who walked with brisk strides into the office of the Admiral. The gold-striped arm of the uniformed man was extended in quick greeting. "Made it, did you? Congratulations." "All okay," Thorpe agreed. "Ship and log are ready for your verification." "Talk sense. Have you any trouble or excitement? Perhaps you're more interested in collecting on your certain bet than you are discussing the trip." "Damn the bet. And that's just what I'm here for, to talk about the trip. There were some little incidents that may interest you." He painted for the Admiral in brief, terse sentences, a picture of that daybreak on the Pacific, the line of breakers white in the vanishing night, the abandoned ship beyond cracking her canvas to tatters in the freshening breeze, and he told of his boarding her and what he'd found. "Where was this?" asked the officer, and Thorpe gave his position as he had checked it. "I reported the derelict to a passing steamer that came that same day," he added, but the Admiral was calling for a chart. He spread it on the desk before him and placed the tip of a pencil in the center of an unbroken expanse. "Breakers, you said?" "There are hundreds of fathoms there, Mr. Thorpe." "I know it, but I saw them. A stretch of white water for 1/8 of a mile. I know it's impossible, but it's true. Forget that item for a time, Admiral. Look at this." He opened his briefcase and took out a logbook and some other papers. This is the log of the Mini-R. Nothing in it but routine entries up to the morning, and then nothing at all. It's abandoned, and they didn't take the boats. There have been other instances, never explained. See if this helps any, suggested Thorpe, and handed the other 2 sheets of paper. They were in the captain's cabin. Admiral Struthers glanced at them and then settled back in his chair. Dated September 4th. That would have been the day previous to the time you found her. The writing was plain and in a careful, well-formed hand. He cleared his throat and read aloud. Written by Jeremiah Wilkins of Salem, Massachusetts, master of the Mini-R, bound from Shanghai to San Pedro. I've sailed the seas for 40 years, and for the first time, I am afraid. I hope I may destroy this paper when the lights of San Pedro are safe in sight, but I'm writing here what it would shame me to set down on the ship's log, though I know there are stranger happenings on the face of the waters than man has ever seen or lived to tell. All this day I've been filled with fear. I've been watched. I've felt it as surely as if a devil out of hell stood beside me with his eyes fastened on mine. The men have felt it too. They've been frightened at nothing and have tried to conceal it, as I have done, and the animals, well. A shark has followed us for 3 days. It's gone today. The cats, we have 3 on board, have howled horribly and have hidden themselves in a cargo down below. The mate is bringing a big monkey to be sold in Los Angeles, an orangutan he calls it. It's been an ugly brute, shaking at the bars of its cage and showing its ugly teeth ever since we left port. But today it's crouched in the corner of its cage and will not stir even for food. The poor beast is in mortal terror. All this is more like the wandering tale of an old woman muttering in a corner by the fireside of witches and the like, than it is like a truthful account set down by me, Jeremiah Wilkins. And now that I've written it, I can see there's nothing to tell, nothing beyond the shameful account of my fear or some horror beyond my knowing. And now that it's written, I am tempted to destroy it. No, I will wait. And now what is this? Admiral Struthers interrupted his reading to ask. He turned the paper to read a coarse, slanting scrawl at the bottom of the page. The eyes. The eyes. They're everywhere above us. God help us. The writing trailed off in a straggling line. The lips beneath the trim gray mustache drew themselves into a hard line, and it was a moment before Admiral Struthers raised his eyes to meet those of Robert Thorpe. You found this in the captain's cabin? Yes. And the captain was gone? Bloodstains? No, but the door had been burst off its hinges. There had been a struggle, without a doubt. The officer mused on this for a minute or 2. Did they go aboard another vessel? Abandoned ship, open the what's the word I'm looking for? It has a word, but I don't want to say it. Open the ballast doors, sink it for the insurance? He was trying vainly to find some answer to the problem, some explanation that would not impose too great a strain upon his own reason. I've reported it to the owners. The Mini-R was not heavily insured. The Admiral ruffled some papers on his desk to find a report. There's been another. A tramp freighter is listed as missing. She was reported last due east of the position you give. She was coming this way, must have come about through the same water. He caught himself up abruptly. Thorpe sensed that an admiral of the Navy must not lend too credulous an ear to impossible stories. You've had an interesting experience, Mr. Thorpe. Most interesting. Probably a derelict is the answer, some hull just afloat. We'll send out a general warning. He handed the loose papers and the logbook to the younger man. This stuff is rubbish. Captain Wilkins held his command a year or so too long. You'll do nothing about it? Thorpe asked in astonishment. I said I would warn all shipping. There's nothing more to be done. I think there is. Thorpe's gray eye was steady as he regarded the man at the desk. I intend to run it down. There have been other such instances, as you said, and they have never been explained. I'm going to find the answer. Admiral Struthers smiled indulgently at this. Always after excitement. You'll be writing another book, I expect. I look forward to reading it. But just what are you going to do? I'm going to the islands. I'm going to charter a small ship of some sort. I'm going to go out there and camp on that spot, in the hope of seeing those eyes and what's behind them. I'm leaving tonight. Admiral Struthers leaned back to indulge in a hearty laugh. I refused you passage on a destroyer once, and it was an expensive mistake. I don't make the same mistake twice. I'm going to offer you a trip. The Bennington is leaving today on a cruise to Manila. I'll hold her an extra hour or two. Oh, wait, no, that's still the Admiral. They just trailed off in the middle of it. Now I'm going to offer you a trip. The Bennington is leaving today on a cruise to Manila. I'll hold her an extra hour, or perhaps two if you'd like to go. She can drop you at Honolulu or wherever you say. Lieutenant Commander Brent is in command. You remember him in Manila, of course. Fine, I'll be there. And, he added, as he took the Admiral's hand, if I didn't object to betting on a sure thing, I would make you a little proposition. I'd bet any money that you would give your shirt to go along. I never bet either on a sure loss. Now get out of here, you young troubleshooter, and let the Navy get to work. His eyes were twinkling as he waved the young man out. Hang on just a moment. I'm just going to pause the recording for a moment. But for the people who are listening to the recording, that wasn't anything at all. Anyway, where was I? Thorpe found himself comfortably fixed on the Bennington. Brent, her commander, was a fine example of the aggressive young chaps that the destroyer fleet breeds, and he liked to play cribbage, Thorpe found. They were pegging away industrially the sixth night when the first SOS reached them. A message was placed before the commander, and he read it and tossed it to Thorpe as he rose from his chair. SOS, said the radio sheet. Nagasaki Maru. 2435 north, 158 west. Struck something unknown. Down to the bow. May need help. Please stand by. Captain Brent left the room at this, and a moment later, the quiver and tremble of the Bennington told Thorpe that they were running full speed for the position of the stricken ship. But 2435 north, and less than 2 degrees west of where the poor old Miniar got hers. I wonder. We'll be there in 4 hours. All of the Navy people have the same voice, said Captain Brent on his return. Hope she lasts, but what have they struck out there? A derelict, probably, though she should have had Admiral Struthers' warning. Robert Thorpe made no other reply than, Wait here a minute, Brent. I have something to show you. He hadn't told the officer of his mission, nor of his experience, but he did now, and he placed before him the wildly improbable statement of the late Captain Wilkins. Something's there, just awash, probably, no superstructure visible. Your Miniar hit the same thing. Something's there? I just wish I knew what. This stuff has gotten to you, has it? Asked Brent as he returned the papers to Captain Wilkins. He was quite evidently amused at the thought. You weren't on the ship. There was nothing to see, and nothing I could tell of anyway, but I know. He followed Brent to the wireless room. Can you get the Nagasaki? They know we're coming, sir, but we seem to be the only one anywhere near. He handed the captain another message. Something odd about that. USS Bennington. We are still afloat. On even keel now, but low in water. No water coming in, engines full speed ahead, but we make no headway. Apparently we're aground. That's impossible. What? He left the question uncompleted. The radio man was writing rapidly. Some message was coming at top speed. Both Brent and Thorpe leaned over the man's shoulder to read as he wrote, Bennington, help. Bennington, help. Sinking fast, decks almost awash, we are being... In breathless silence, they watched the pencil poised above the paper, while the operator listened tensely to the silent night. Again his ear received the wild jumble of dots and dashes, sent by a frenzied hand in that far-off room. His pencil automatically set down the words, "Help! Help!" It wrote before Thorpe's spellbound gaze. The eyes! Its attack! And again the black night held only the rush and roar of torn waters, where the destroyer raced, quivering through the darkness. The message, as the waiting men well knew, would never be completed. "A derelict!" Robert Thorpe exclaimed with an unconscious scorn, but Captain Brent was already at a communication tube. Chief, Captain Brent, give her everything you've got. Drive the Bennington faster than she's ever gone before." The slim ship was a quivering lance of steel that threw itself through foaming waters, that shot with an endless, roaring surge of speed toward that distant point in the heaving waste of the Pacific, and that seemed, to the two silent men on the bridge, to put the dragging miles behind them slowly, ever so slowly. "Let me see those papers." He read them in silence. Then, "The eyes? That's what this other poor devil said. Good heavens, Thorpe, what is it? What can it be? We're not all insane." "I don't know what I expected to find. I had thought of many things, each wilder than the next. This Captain Wilkins said the eyes were above him. I had visions of some sky monster. I'd even thought of some strange aircraft from out in space, maybe with round lights like eyes. I'd pictured impossibilities, but now..." "Well, yes, now? There were tales in olden times of the Kraken." "The Kraken? A mythical monster of the sea. It was just a fable." "True. That was just a fable, and one of the things I've learned is how frequently there's a basis of fact underlying a fable, and that, for that matter, how can we know there is no such monster, some relic of a Mesozoic species supposed to be extinct?" He stood motionless, staring far out ahead into the dark, and Brent, too, was silent. They seemed to try, with unaided eyes, to penetrate the dark miles ahead, and see what their sane minds refused to accept. Ooh. I'm hearing a lot about sanity and sane minds. I hope this gets Lovecraftian. That would be really cool. It's good tea. I shouldn't have put that water in it, but it's good tea. It's just green tea with a couple of different flowers in it, but it's good. It's a lot better the second time you steep it because the hibiscus flowers aren't punching you in the face as much anymore, but I digress. It was still dark when the searchlight's sweeping beam picked up the black hull and broad, red-striped funnels of the Nagasaki Maru. She was riding high in the water, and her big bulk rolled and wallowed in the trough of the great swells. The Bennington swept in a swift circle about the helpless hulk, while the lights played incessantly upon her decks. And watching eyes strained vainly for some signal to betoken life, for some sign that her mad race had not been quite vain. Her engines had been shut down, there was no steerage way for the Nagasaki, and from all that they could see, there were no human hands to drag at the levers of her waiting engines, nor to twirl with sure touch the deserted helm. The Maru was abandoned. The lights came steadily upon her as the Bennington came aside, and a boat was swung out smartly in its davits. But Thorpe knew he was not alone in his wild surmises to the cause of the catastrophe. "Throw your lights around the water occasionally, and let me know if you see anything." "Yes, sir. I'll report it if I see any survivors or boats." "Report anything you see." "You go aboard if you want to. I'll stay here and be ready if you need help," he suggested to Thorpe. And Thorpe nodded his approval as the small boat pulled away in the dark, for there was activity apparent on the destroyer not warranted by a mere rescue at sea. Gun crews rushed to their stations. The tarpaulin covers were off the guns, and their slender lengths gleamed where they covered the course of the boat. Brent is ready for anything. They found the iron ladder against the ship's side, and a sailor sprang forward and made his way aboard. Thorpe was not the last to set foot on deck, and he shuddered involuntarily at the eerie silence he knew awaited them. It was the Mini-R over again, as he expected, but with a difference. The sailing vessel, before he boarded it, had been for some time exposed to the sun, while the Nagasaki Maru had not. And here there were slimy trails still wet on the decks. He went first to the wireless room. He must know the final answer to that interrupted message, and he found it in emptiness. No radio man was waiting him there. Not even a body to show the loser of an unequal battle. But there was blood on the door jamb where a body, a man's body, Thorpe was sure, had been smashed against the wood. A wisp of black hair in the blood gave its mute evidence of the hopeless fight, and the slime, like the trails on the deck, smeared with odorous vileness the whole room. Thorpe went again to the deck, and as on the other ship, he breathed deeply to rid his lungs and nostrils of the abhorrent stench. The ensign in charge of the boarding party approached.
What sort of rotten mess is this? The ship is filthy and not a soul on board. Not a man of them, officers or crew, and the boats are all here. It's absolutely amazing, isn't it?
No, about what I expected, actually. What do you make of this? He touched with his foot a broad trail that shone wet in the Bennington's lights.
Heaven only knows. It's all over. It smells like a rotten dead fish. Well, we're going to be going back, sir, though.
He called to a petty officer to round up the men. The boat was brought alongside. They returned to the Bennington again through a pathway of light that Thorpe knew was safe under the black muzzles of the destroyer's guns. Or was it? Safe? Was anything safe from this devilish mystery that could pluck each cowering human from the lowest depths of the steel freighter? It could drag her down in the water till the radio man sent his cry that we were sinking. He told Brent quietly, after the ensign had reported, of course, the struggles in the wireless room and its few remaining traces, and he watched with the commander through the hour of darkness, while the Bennington steamed in slow circles about the abandoned hulk, while her searchlights played endlessly over the empty waters, and the men at guns cast wondering glances at their skipper, who ordered such strange procedure when no danger was there. With the daylight, the scene lost its sense of mysterious threat, and Thorpe was eager to return to the abandoned ship. I might find something, some trace or indication of what we have to fight.
I must leave. I'm coming back, never fear,
added Commander Brent with a look of dismay on Thorpe's face. The thought of leaving this mystery unsolved was more than that young seeker after adventure could accept.
I'm coming back. I have been in communication with the Admiral. Honolulu has relayed the messages through. All code, of course. We mustn't alarm the whole Pacific with our nightmares. The old man says to stick around and get the lowdown on this thing.
Then why leave?
Because I'm coming around to your way of thinking, Thorpe. I'm as certain as can be that we have a monster of some sort to deal with, and because I haven't any depth charges, I want to run up to the supply station at Honolulu and get a couple of ash cans of TNT to lay on top of the brood if we light it.
That sounds like business. Go and get your eggs, and perhaps we can feed them to this devil. Raw. And I think I'll stay here if you'll be back by dark.
Better not.
Several people objected to this, but Thorpe overruled them. This thing attacks in the dark. I'll lay a little bet on that. It left the orangutan on the Mini-R. It quit at the first sign of daylight. I'll be safe through the day, and besides, the beast has gutted this ship. It won't return, I imagine. And if I stay there for the day, live as they live, the men who manned that ship, I may have some information that'll be of help when you get back. But for heaven's sake, Brent, don't stop to pick any flowers on the way.
It's your funeral. The old man said to give you every assistance, and perhaps that includes helping you kill yourself, for crying out loud.
But Thorpe only laughed as Commander Brent gave his orders for a small boat to be lowered. A ship's lantern and rockets for night signals were taken at the officer's orders. We'll be back before dark, but take these as a precaution. One favor Thorpe asked, that the ship's carpenter go over with him and help them make a strong barred retreat of the wireless cabin. I'll talk to you occasionally, he told Brent. I tried the key while I was aboard. The wireless is working on its batteries. At this, he waved a cheery goodbye as the small boat pulled away. Hurry back! The destroyer commander nodded an emphatic assent. On board the Nagasaki Maru, Thorpe directed the carpenter and his helpers in the work he wanted done. The man seemed to know instinctively where to put his hands on needed supplies, and the result was a virtual cage of strong oak bars, enclosing the wireless room and braces of oak to bar the single door. Thorpe was not assuming any bravado in his feeling of safety, but he was doing what he'd done in many other tight corners, and he prepared his defenses in advance. That included weapons of offense as well. As the boat with the destroyer's men pulled back to the Bennington, he placed in easy reach in a corner of the room a heavy-calibered rifle he'd taken from his belongings. And still, with all his feeling of security, there was a strange depression that fell upon him when the Bennington's narrow hull was small upon the horizon. And then that too was gone, and only the heaving swells and the wallowing hulk were his companions. Only these? He shivered slightly as he thought of that unseen watcher with the devil eyes whose presence Captain Wilkins had felt, and his men and the poor terrified ape. He deliberately put from his mind the thought of this. There was no use to start the day with morbid fears. He went below to examine the cabins, but he carried the heavy elephant gun with him wherever he went. Below decks, the signs of the marauder were everywhere, and yet there was little to be learned. The slimy trails dried quickly and vanished, but not before Thorpe had traced them to the uttermost depths of the ship. There was not a nook or corner that had gone unsearched in that horrible quest for human food. And one thing impressed itself forcibly upon the man's mind. He had found a lantern and used it of necessity in his explorations, but this thing had gone through the dark with unerring certainty, finding its way to every victim. Can it see in the dark? Or... He visioned dimly some denizen of the vast depths, living beyond the limits of the sun's penetration, far off in the abysmal darkness, where its only light must be self-made. But his mind failed in the attempt to picture what manner of horror this thing might be. Even in the hold its evil traces were found. There were tiers of metal drums that still shone wet in the lantern's light. Calcium carbide from making acetylene, calcium carbide for making acetylene, he supposed, marked made in the USA. Nagasaki must have been westward bound. He went after an hour or so to the wireless room, and only when he relaxed in the safety of his improvised fortress did he realize how tense had been every nerve and muscle through his long search. He tried the wireless and got an instant response from the destroyer. "Don't shoot it too fast," he spelled out slowly to the distant operator. "I'm only a dub. I just wanted to say hello and report all okay." "Fine," was the steady, careful response. "We've had a little trouble with our condensers." There was a short pause, then the message continued, this portion dictated by the commander. "Delay not important. We will be back as agreed. Have picked up SS Adelaide bound east in your latitude. Warned her to take northerly course, account derelict. See you later. Signed, Brent, commanding USS Bennington." The man in the barred room tapped off his acknowledgement and closed the key. He suddenly realized he'd had no breakfast, and the hours had been slipping past. He took his gun again and went down to the galley to prepare some coffee. It wasn't the time or place for an enjoyable meal, but he would have relished it more had he not pictured the Adelaide and her lovely owner steaming across these threatening seas. He knew the captain of the Adelaide. Obstinate, pig-headed old Scotchman. Hope he takes Brent's advice. Of course, Brent couldn't tell him the truth. But we can't blat this wild yarn all over the air, or passenger lines would have our scalps. But I wish the Adelaide was safe in Manila. His explorations in the afternoon were half-hearted and perfunctory. There was nothing more to be learned, but he had seen in his mind some vague outline of what they must meet. He saw a something, mammoth, huge, that could grasp and hold an ocean freighter, against whose great body he'd seen the waves dash in a line of white spray. And yet a something that could force its way down narrow passages, could press with terrific strength on bolted doors and crush them inward, wrecked and splintered. Some serpentine thing that felt and saw its way and crawled so surely through the dark, found its prey and seized it, and carried off a man as easily as it might a mouse. No octopus, no matter what the proportions, filled the description. He gave up trying to see too clearly the awful thing, and he kept away from the ship's rail when once he had ventured near, for there had come to him a feeling of fear that sent waves of cold trickling and prickling up his spine. Was there something really there? A waiting, lurking horror in the depths? The eyes, he thought, and went more quickly than he knew to his barred retreat, where again he might breathe quietly. The position of the dirt ship. Yes, it's just a ship of packed dirt. No. The position of the deserted ship was south of the regular steamer lanes on the Trans-Pacific run. Only a trace of smoke on the northern horizon marked through the afternoon the passage of the other craft. It was a long and lonely vigil for the waiting man. But the Bennington would return, and he listened in at intervals, hoping to hear her friendly signal. The batteries operating the Nagasaki's wireless were none too strong. Thorpe saved their strength, though he tried at times to raise the Bennington somewhere beyond his reach. The sun was touching the horizon when he got his first response. "Keep up the old nerve," admonished the slow, careful sending the operator of the Bennington's key. "We've been delayed, but we're on our way. Signed, Brent." The man in the wireless room placed the oak bars across the door and tried to believe he was nonchalant and unafraid as he laid out clips of extra cartridges. But his eyes persisted in following the sinking sun, and he watched from within his cage the coming of the quick dark. The protecting glare of the day must be unbearable to this monster from the lightless depths, and daylight was vanishing. Thorpe's mind was searching for additional means of defense. He found it in the cargo he'd seen, drums of carbide. He could scatter it on the deck. It reacted with water, and those slimy arms, if they came and touched it, would find the contact hot. He took his lantern and went hastily below, to stagger back with the drum upon his shoulder. In the half-light that was left him, he forced the cover and then rolled the drum about the swaying deck. The gray, earthly lumps of carbide formed erratic lines. Useless, perhaps, but the threatening dark forced man to use every means at his command. He was scattering the contents of a second drum when he stiffened abruptly to rigid attention. The ship, thrown broadside to the wide-spaced swells... Okay, my computer's deciding to be loud, it's fine. The ship, thrown broadside to the wide-spaced swells, had rolled endlessly with a monotonous motion, but now the deck beneath him was steadying. It assumed an abnormal levelness. The boat rose and fell with the waves, but it no longer rolled. There was something beneath holding, drawing on it. Thorpe knew in that frozen second what it meant. The drum clattered to the rail as he dashed for his room. Gun in hand, he watched with staring eyes where the deserted deck showed dim and vague in the light of the stars, and the bow of the ship was lost in the uncertain dark of night. Wide-eyed, he watched into the blackness, and he listened with desperate attention for some of the slightest sound, beyond the splashing of waves and the creaking of spars. Far in the west a light appeared, to glow and vanish and glow again in the tumbling waters. The Bennington. His heart leapt at the thought, and then sank, as he knew the destroyer's lights would not appear from that direction. Through a slow hour that seemed an eternity for the coming ship, it drew near, and he knew with a sudden startling certainty that it was the Adelaide and Ruth Allaire coming on, through the horror awaiting. He leaned forward tensely as the sound reached his ears, a ghostly echo of a sound, like the softest of smooth slipping fabric upon hard steel. And as he listened, before his staring eyes, a something became clear between him and the lighted yacht. It wavered and swung in the darkness. It was formless, uncertain of outline, and it swung the night out beyond the ship's rail, till it suddenly neared, waved high overhead, and the cold light of the stars shone in pale reflection from an enormous staring eye. It surmounted a serpentine form that took shape in the dim radiance without, and came lower in undulating folds to crash heavily upon the deck. Thorpe's hand was upon the wireless key. He'd wanted to warn off the yacht, but not till the thud of the creature on the bare deck proved its reality could he force his fingers to press the key. Then, as fast as his inexperience allowed, he called frantically for the Adelaide. He spelled her name over and over. Did the sleepy operator never answer? Then Bennington broke in one. "Is that you, Thorpe? What's going on?" But Thorpe kept up his slow spelling of the yacht's name. He must get a warning to them. Then he realized that Bennington could do it better. "Bennington, Adelaide approaching. I'm attacked. Warn them off. Warn them." His frantic, hissing dots and dashes died immediately. Beneath his feet the Nagasaki Maru was rolling again, swinging free to the lift and thrust of the swells beneath. Good heavens, it's gone for the yacht! Adelaide turned north full speed. He clicked off a slow, stuttering key. "Head north. You're being attacked." He groaned again as he saw the Adelaide's shining ports swing away from the safety of the north. The ship broached broadside to the waves and came slowly to a stop. "Bennington, Brent, it's got the Adelaide. Hurry, I'm going over." He tore wildly at the barred door and made a dash across the deck, to slip sprawling in a heap against the rail where the slimy traces of our recent visitor stretched glistening on the deck. How he lowered the boat, Thorpe never knew, but he knew there was one, that the men from the Bennington had swung over the side and tore madly at the tackle to let the boat crash miraculously upright into the sea. He slung the rifle about his neck with a rope end. There were cartridges in his pocket. And he went down the dangling lines and cast off in a frenzy of haste. What could he do? He hardly dared form the question. Only this stood clear and unanswerable in his mind. The yacht was in the monster's grip, and Ruth Allaire was there on board. Ruth Allaire, so smiling, so friendly, so lovable. Food for that horror from the depths. He rowed with superhuman strength to drive the heavy boat across the wave-swept distance that separated them. And between gasping breaths he turned at times to glance over his shoulder and correct his course. And now as he drew near he saw, though indistinct, and the unmistakable snake-like weaving of a horrible tenuous finger, rolling and groping about the yacht. They were plain as he drew alongside. The trim ship rose and fell within the water, while over her side, where Thorpe approached, swung a long, white, monstrous rope of flesh. It retreated like the lash of a whip, and the horrified watcher saw as it went the struggling figure of a man, in the grasp of flabby lips. And above them a single eye glared, wickedly. Another vile, twisting arm rose from the afterdeck, with a screaming figure in its grasp, and vanished into the water beyond the yacht. There were others writhing about the decks, and Thorpe saw them as he made his boat fast and clambered aboard. A wave of reeking air enveloped him as he reached the deck. The nauseous stench from the monster's tentacles was horrible beyond endurance. He gagged and choked as the stifling breath... He gagged and choked as the stifling breath entered his lungs. A huge rope of slippery, throbbing flesh stretched its twisted length toward the stern. It contracted as he watched into bulging, muscular rings and withdrew from the afterdeck. The deadly end of it stopped in midair, not 20 feet from where he stood. The jaw-like pincers on it held the limp form of an officer in its sucking grip, while above, in a protuberance like a gnarled horn, a great eye glared into Thorpe's with devilish hatred. The beak opened sharply to drop its unconscious burden upon the deck, and the watching man, petrified with horror, saw the gaping maw, great sucking discs, and beyond them a brilliant glow. The whole cavernous pit was aflame with a phosphorescent light. Dimly he knew this light explained the ability of the beastly arms to grope so surely in the dark. The eye narrowed as the gaping, fleshy jaws distended, and Robert Thorpe, in a flash that galvanized him to action, was aware that his fight for life was on. He fired blindly from the hip, and the recoil of the heavy gun almost tore it from his hands. But he knew he'd aimed true, and the toothless, seeking jaws whipped in agony back into the sea. There were other arms whose eyes were searching down the stern of the yacht. Thorpe plunged frenziedly down a companionway, for the cabin he knew was Ruth Allaire's. Was he in time? Could he save her if he found her? His mind was in a turmoil of half-formed plans as he rushed madly down the corridor to find the body of a girl, a limp huddle, across the threshold of her cabin. She was alive. He knew it as he swung her body across one shoulder and staggered with his burden up the stairs. If he could only breathe. His throat was tight and strangling with the reeking putrescence in the air, and before his eyes was a picture of the strong oak bars of his own retreat. Somehow, some way, he must get back to the abandoned ship. An eye detected him as he came on deck, and he dropped the limp body of the girl at his feet as he swung his rifle toward the glowing light within the opening jaws. The sucking discs cupped and wrinkled in dread readiness in the fleshy, toothless opening. He emptied the magazine into the head, though he knew this was only a feeler and a feeder for a still more horrible mouth, and the monstrous body that rose and fell tremendously in the dark waters beyond. But it was typical of Robert Thorpe that even in the horror and frenzy of the moment, he rammed another clip of cartridges into his rifle before he stooped again to raise the prostrate figure of Ruth Allaire. The forward deck for the moment was clear. It rose high with the weight of that writhing, twisting arms that had yanked down to the stern of the yacht, where the crew had taken refuge. To think of helping them was worse than folly. He dismissed the thought as another great eye came over the rail. Once more he used the gun, and then lowered the girl to the waiting boat, and cast off, rowing with the stealthiest of strokes into the dark. Behind him there were whipping points of light above the white brilliance of the yacht Adelaide. The boat was tossing in great waves that came from beyond, where a body incredibly huge was tearing the waters to foam. There were ghostly arms that shone in a slimy wetness, that lashed searchingly in all directions as the monster gave vent to fury at Thorpe's attack. There were screaming human figures grasped in many of its jaws, and the man was glad with a great thankfulness that the girl's stupor could save her from the frightful sight. He dared to row now, and his breath was coming in great choking sobs of sheer exhaustion when at last he pulled the senseless form of Ruth Allaire to the deck of the Nagasaki and drew her within the frail shelter of the wireless room. Stout had the oaken bars appeared, and safe as refuge in the barricaded room, but that was before he had seen the horrible reality of the fearful fury of this monster from the deep. He placed the braces against the door and turned with hopeless haste to seize the wireless key. "Bennington," he called, and the answer came strong and clear. "Where are you? Help!" His fingers froze upon the key, and the answering message in his ears was unheeded as he watched across the water the destruction of the yacht. This craft that had dared to resist the onset of the brute, to fight against it, to wound it, was feeling the full fury of the monster's rage. The gleaming lights in the doomed ship were waving lines that swept to and fro in the grip of those monstrous arms. The boat beneath Thorpe's feet was tossing in the waves that told of the titanic struggle. He had meant to look south for some sign of the oncoming destroyer, but in fearful fascination he instead stared spellbound where the masts of the trim yacht swept downward into the waves, where the green of her starboard lantern glowed faintly for an instant and then vanished, to leave only the darkness and the starlit sea. Suddenly a voice roused him from his stupefaction. Where am I?" Ruth Allaire asked in a frightened whisper. That terrible thing." She shuddered violently as memory returned to show again the horror she'd witnessed. "Where are we, Robert? The Adelaide, where is it?" Thorpe turned slowly. The insane turmoil of the past hour had numbed his brain and stunned him. "The Adelaide," he mumbled and groped fumblingly for coherent thoughts. He stared at the girl. She was half risen from the floor where he had laid her, and the sight of her quivering face brought reason again to his mind. He knelt tenderly beside her and raised her in his arms. "Where's the yacht? The Adelaide?" "It's gone." A thought struck him. A thought struck him at this. "Was your father on board, Ruth?" "Lost. The Adelaide lost. No," she added in belated response to Thorpe's question. "Dad wasn't there, but the men, Captain McPherson, that horrible monster." She buried her face in her hands as she realized what Thorpe's silence meant. He held the trembling figure close as the girl whispered, "Where are we, Robert? Are we safe?" "We may win through yet," he told her through grim, set lips. And he realized abruptly that he was seeing the face of Ruth Allaire in the light. He'd left a lantern burning. He withdrew his arms from about her and sprang quickly to his feet to put out the telltale light. In darkness and quiet was their only safety, and he knew as he sprang that he'd waited too long. A soft body crashed heavily on the deck outside. The girl's voice was shrill with terror as she began a question. Thorpe's hand pressed upon her lips in the dark where she stood waiting and watching. A luminous something was glowing outside the cabin. It searched and prodded about the deserted deck to whip upward at the audible hiss of wet carbide. Another appeared. The rifle came slowly to the man's shoulder as a pair of jaws gaped glowingly beyond the windows, and an eye stared unblinkingly from its horn-like sheath. It crashed madly against the walls of the wireless room to shatter the glass and make kindling of the woodwork of the sash. Thorpe fired again and again before the spectre vanished, and he knew with sickening certainty that the wounds were only messages to some central brain that would send other ravening tentacles against them. But the oak bars had held. He had reached in brief interval for the key, and he sent out one final call for help. He strained his ears against the headset for some friendly human word of hope. "Rocket," the wireless man was saying. "Fire rockets we can't find." A swift, writhing arm wrapped crushingly about the cabin as the message ceased. Thorpe seized his rifle and fired into the gray mass that bulged with terrible muscular contractions through the window. He fired again to aim lengthways of the arm and permit as damaging a wound as his weapon could permit. The arm relaxed, but a score of others took up the attack. Again the sickening stench was about them. His gaping jaws gleamed fiery beneath the hateful eyes and tore at the flimsy structure. Thorpe jammed more cartridges into the gun and fired again and again, then dropped the weapon to fumble for the rockets that Brent had given him. He lighted one with trembling fingers. The first ball shot straight into a waiting mouth. Another ignited a searing flame of acetylene gas, where a wet arm writhed in a hot carbide trail. The man leaned far out through the broken window. There was no time to look around. He let the red flare stream upward high into the air, then dropped the rocket hissing on the deck to seize once more the rifle. A mass of muscle crashed against the door, and it went to splinters under the impact. But only the two oak bars remained to hold in check the terrible tentacles from the darting heads. One mouth closed to a pointed end that forced its way beneath the bars. The oak gave under the strain as Robert Thorpe pulled vainly at an empty gun. Behind him rose shrieks of terror as the monstrous thing came on, and Thorpe beat with frantic fury, with his clubbed rifle at the fleshy snout. He knew as he swung the weapon that the streaks had ceased, and then smiled grimly in the numbing horror as he realized Ruth Allaire was beside him. A piece of oak was in her hands, and she was striking with desperate and silent fury at the slimy flesh. It was the end, Thorpe knew, and suddenly he was glad. The nightmare was over. The end was coming with his girl beside him. But Thorpe was fighting on to the last, and he tried to make his blows reach outward to the hateful, devilish eye. He saw it plainly now. The deck was a glare of white light. He saw the eye and the thick arm behind it, and the score of others that made a heaving, knotted mass were brilliant and wetly shining. He could see now how best to strike, and he turned his gun to thrust with the barrel at the eye. It withdrew before his stroke. The jaws slid backward to the deck. There were sounds that hammered at his ears. "The guns! The guns!" Across the deck, when a searchlight played, huge arms were lashing backward toward the sea. The waves beyond had vanished where a monstrous body shone wetly black in a blinding glare, and the man hung panting, helpless, on the one remaining bar across the doorway to look where, beyond, her forward gun spitting a stream of staccato flashes, the Bennington tore the waves to high-thrown spray. Her 4 clean funnels swung far over it as the slim ship, with her stabbing, crashing guns, swung in a sweeping circle to bear down upon the black bulk, slowly sinking in the searchlight's glare. The vast body had vanished as the destroyer shot like one of her own projectiles over the spot where the beast had lain. And then where she had passed, the sea arose in a heaving mound. The big ship beneath the watching man shuddered again as another depth charge grumbled its challenge to the master of the deeps. The warship went careening on an arc, to return and throw the full glare of her searchlights on the scene. They lighted a vast sea that was strangely stilled. An oily smoothness leveled waves and ironed them out to show more clearly the convulsions of a torn mass that rose slowly into sight. Thorpe in some way found himself outside the cabin, and he knew that the girl was beside him again as he stared and stared at what the waters held. A bloated serpent form beyond believing was struggling in the greasy swell. Its waving tentacles again were flung aloft in impotent fury, and beneath them, where their thick ends joined in the body, a head with one horrible eye rose into the air. A thick-lipped mouth gaped open, and the gleam of molars shone white in the blinding glare. The twisting body shuddered throughout its vast bulk, and the waving arms and futile staring eyes dropped helpless into the splashing sea. Again the revolting head was raised as the destroyer sent a rain of shells into its fearful mass. Once more the oily seas were calm. They closed over the whirling vortex where a denizen of the lightless depths was returning to those distant subterranean caverns, returning as food for what other voracious monsters might still exist. The man's arm was now about the figure of the girl, trembling anew in a fresh reaction from the horror that they had escaped when a small boat drew alongside. "They're safe!" A hoarse voice bellowed back up to the destroyer, and a man came monkey-wise up a rope, where Thorpe had launched his boat. And now, as one in a dream, Thorpe allowed the girl to be taken from him, to be lowered into the waiting boat. Then he clambered down himself, and in silence was rowed across to the destroyer. Thank God, said Brent as he met them at the rail. "You're safe, and missile air, both of you. You let off that rocket just in time. We couldn't pick you up with our light. And now we're going back to San Diego. The Admiral wants a word-of-mouth report." Thorpe stilled him with a heavy gesture. Give Ruth an opiate. Let her forget. Forget. Can we ever forget? He stumbled forward, heedless of Brent's arm across his shoulders, as the surgeon took the girl in charge. Admiral Struthers of the U.S. Navy leaned back from his desk and blew a cloud of smoke thoughtfully toward the ceiling. He looked silently from Thorpe to Commander Brent. "If either one of you had come to me with such a report, I'd have found it incredible. I'd have thought you were entirely insane or trying some wild hoax." "I wish it were a lie. I wish I didn't have to believe it." There were new lines about the young man's eyes, lines that spoke what the lips could not confess, of sleepless nights and the impress of a picture he could not erase. "Well, we've kept it out of the papers. Said it was a derelict, and the wild messages floating about were from an inexperienced man, frightened and irresponsible. Bad advertising, very, for the passenger lines." Quite. But of course, Mr. Thorpe may want to use us in his next book of travel. He's earned the right without doubt." No. I told you, Brent, there was often a factual basis for fables, remember? We've just proved that. Sometimes it's just best to leave the fables just fables. I think you'll agree. A light step sounded in the corridor beyond. "Nothing of this to Miss Allaire." The men rose as Ruth Allaire entered the room. "We were just speaking," the Admiral said with an engaging smile beneath his mustache, "of the matter of a bet. Mr. Thorpe has won handily, and he's taught me a lesson, you see." He took a checkbook from his desk. "What charity would you like to name, Miss Allaire? That was left to you, you remember." "Some seaman's home. You'll know best if you two are really serious about that silly bet." "That bet, my dear, was very serious, and it has had most serious consequences." He turned to the waiting men and extended a hand in farewell, a smile gracing his eyes. "We're going to Ruth, your We're going to Ruth, Europe and I. Yes, definitely not backwards. We're going to Europe, Ruth and I. Just rambling about a bit. Our honeymoon, you know. Look us up if you're cruising out that way. Ooh, dang. Now we got a part 2 of Murder Madness. I don't remember the first part of this one. We'll see how well that holds up, I guess, then. Just give me a moment. I'm gonna... Actually, it's been about an hour in. We're gonna take a short little baby break for everybody to, you know, get some stretches in. Maybe make some tea, have a snack, you know, the usual things that we do about an hour into this thing. So we'll return in a moment. And I'll see you then. Okay, now that everyone's gotten their stretch and maybe a snack in, let's get back to it, shall we? We're starting in on our next story, Murder Madness, part 2 of a 4-part novel that I don't remember the first part of because, you know, I have the memory of a goldfish apparently, but it's whatever. Murder Madness by Murray Leinster. 7 United States Secret Servicemen have disappeared in South America. Another is found, a screaming homicidal maniac. It is rumored that they are victims of a diabolical poison which produces murder madness. Charlie Bell of the Trade, a Secret Service organization that doesn't officially exist, discovers that a sinister system of slavery is flourishing in South America, headed by a mysterious man known only as the Master. This slavery is accomplished by means of a poison which causes its victims to experience a horrible writhing of the hands, followed by a madness to do murder, 2 weeks after the poison is taken. The victims get relief only with an antidote supplied through Ribiera, the Master's chief deputy, but in the antidote there is more of the poison, which again in 2 weeks will take effect. And so it is that a person who once receives the poison is forever enslaved. Bell learns that Ribiera has kidnapped Paula Canalejas, daughter of a Brazilian cabinet minister, himself a victim, who has killed himself on feeling the murder madness caused by the poison coming over. Bell corners Ribiera in his home, buries the muzzles of 2 6-guns in his stomach, and demands that he set Paula free. In this room, the electric lights were necessary at all times, and it occurred to Bell irrelevantly, that perhaps there were no windows because there might be sometimes rather noisy scenes within these walls. And windows will convey the sound of screaming to the outside air, while solid walls should not. He stood alert and grim with his revolvers pressing into Ribiera's flabby flesh. His fingers were tensed upon the triggers. If he killed Ribiera, he would be killed, of course, and men and women he'd known and liked might be doomed to the most horrible of fates by Ribiera's death. And yet even the death or madness of many men was preferable to the success of the conspiracy in which Ribiera seemed to figure largely. Ribiera looked up at him with the eyes of a terrified snake. There was a little stirring at the door. "Your friends had better not come close," said Bell softly. Ribiera gasped an order, and the stirring stopped. Paula came slowly into the room, quite alone, and she smiled strangely at Bell. "I believed you would come, and yet I didn't know we could escape." "We're going to try." To Ribiera he added curtly, "You'd better order the path cleared to the door, or have one of your cars brought around." Ribiera croaked a repetition of the command. "Now stand up slowly. Very slowly. I don't want to die, Ribiera, so I don't want to kill you. But I haven't much hope of escape, so I shouldn't hesitate very long about doing it. And I've got these guns' hammers trembling at the ready. If I get a bullet through my head, they'll go off just the same and kill you." Ribiera got up slowly, and his face was a pasty gray. "Your majordomo," Bell told him matter-of-factly, "will go before us and open every door on both sides of the way to the street. Paula," he had used her given name without thought and without realizing it, "Paula will go and look into each door. If she as much as looks frightened, I fire and try to fight the rest of the way clear. Understand?
I'm going to get down to a boat I have ready in the harbor if I have to kill you and every living soul in the house. Dang, this got serious quick. There was no boat in the harbor, naturally, but the majordomo moved hesitantly across the room, looking at his master for orders. For Ribiera to die meant death or madness to his slaves. The majordomo's face was ghastly with fear, and he moved onward. Belle heard the sound of doors being thrust wide. Once he gave a command in the staccato fashion of a terrified man, and Belle nodded grimly. Now we'll move. Slowly, Ribiera. Always slowly. That's better. Paula, you go on before and look into each room. I'll be sorry if any of your servants follow after you, Ribiera. Through the doorway, yes. All clear, Paula. I'm balancing the hammers very carefully, Ribiera. Very delicate work. It's fortunate for you that my nerves are rather steady, but really, I don't much care. Still all clear before us, Paula? With the servants nerve-racked as they are, I believe we'll make it through, even if I do happen to, kill Ribiera. There'll be no particular point in killing us then. It won't help them. Don't stumble, please, Ribiera. Go carefully and very slowly. Ribiera's face was a gray mask of terror when they reached the door. A long, low car with 2 men on the chauffeur's seat was waiting. Only 1 man up front, Ribiera. No ostentation, please. I hope your servants haven't summoned the police, because they might want to stop me from marching you out there with the gun in the small of your back, and that would be deplorable, Ribiera, quite deplorable. With a glance, he ordered Paula into the tonneau. He followed her, driving Ribiera before him, and there seemed to be none about but the stricken, terrified servant who would open the door for their exit. My friend, Belle told the majordomo grimly, I'll give you a bit of comfort. I'm not going to try to take the Signor Ribiera away with me. Once I'm on board the yacht that waits for me, I'll release him so he can keep you poor devils sane until my government has found a way to beat this devilish poison of his. Then I'll come back and kill him. Very simple. And you can tell the chauffeur to drive us to the Biera Mar. He settled back in his seat. There were beads of perspiration on his forehead, but he couldn't wipe them off. Instead, he held the 2 revolvers against Ribiera's body. The car turned the corner, and he added dryly, Your servants, Ribiera, will warn your more prominent thralls of my intention of going on board a yacht. Preparations will be made to stop every pleasure boat and search it for me. So tell your chauffeur to swing about and make for the flying field. And tell him to drive carefully, by the way. I've still got these guns on a very fine adjustment of the trigger. Ribiera croaked the order, and Belle was exactly savage enough to kill him if he didn't escape. For 20 minutes the car sped through the residential districts of Rio. The sun was high in the air, but clouds were banking up above the Pau d'Ascar, the sugar loaf, and it looked as if there might be one of the sudden summer thunderstorms that sometimes swept Rio. Then the clear road to the flying field. Rio is the largest metropolitan district in the world, but a great deal of it is piled on end, and Rio itself is built on most of the rest. The flying field is necessarily some miles from even the residential districts, for the sake of a level plain of sufficient area. The car shot ahead through practically untouched jungle, interspersed with tiny clearings in which there were patchwork houses that might have been 1,000 miles in the interior instead of so near the center of all civilization, in Brazil. Up smooth gradients, around beautifully engineered curves. Belle put aside 1 revolver long enough to search Ribiera carefully. He found a pearl-handled automatic, and handed it to Paula. Worth having. I wonder if you'd mind searching the chauffeur. With that gun at his head, I think he'd be peaceful. You needn't have him stop. Paula stood up and smiled a little. I didn't think I lacked courage, senor, but you have taught me more. Ni les prendum. That's probably not Spanish, but I said it Spanish-like, so it's fine. He relaxed deliberately. Matters would be tense at the flying field, and he would need to be wholly calm. There was little danger of an attempt to rescue here, and the necessity of being ready to shoot Ribiera at any instant was no longer a matter of split seconds. He watched, while bent over the back of the front seat, she extracted 2 squat weapons from the chauffeur's pockets. Quite an arsenal, said Belle as he pocketed them. He turned pleasantly to Ribiera. Now, Ribiera, you understand just what I want. That big amphibian plane of yours is fairly fast, and once, when I was merely your guest, you assured me it's always kept fueled and evenly provisioned.
for a long flight. When we reach the flying field, I want it rolled out and warmed up over the other end of the field from the flying line. We'll go over to it in the car. And I've thought of something. It worried me before, because sometimes if a man's shot, he merely relaxes all over. So while we're at the flying field, I'm going to be holding back the triggers of these guns with my thumbs. I don't have to pull the trigger at all. Just let go and they'll go off. It isn't so fine an adjustment as I had just now, but it's safer for you as long as you behave. And you might urge your chauffeur to be cautious. I do hope, Ribiera, that you won't look as if you're getting frightened. If there's any hitch and delay for letting some fuel out of the tanks or messing up the motors, I'll be very sorry for you. The car swooped out into the bright sunshine. The flying field lay below, already in the shadow of the banking clouds above. Hangars lay stretched out across the level space. Through the gates they went, and Ribiera licked his lips. Bell jammed the revolver muzzles closer against his sides, and the chauffeur halted the car. Paula spoke softly to him, and he stiffened. Bell found it possible to smile faintly. Ribiera gave a few terse orders. There was a moment's pause, the revolver's muzzle digging deeper into his side, and he snarled a repetition. The official cringed and moved swiftly. You seem to have chosen your thralls well, Ribiera. They seem to occupy all those strategic positions. We'll ride across. The gears clashed, and the car swerved forward and went deliberately across the wide, clear space that was the flying field. It halted near the farther side. In minutes the door of a hangar swung wide. There was the spluttering of a not yet warmed up motor. The big plane came slowly out, its motors coughing now and again. It swung clumsily across the field, turned in a wide circle, and stopped some 40 or 50 feet from the car. Send the mechanic back on foot. Again Ribiera found it expedient to snarl, and Bell added gently while the throttle down motors of the big amphibian boomed on, Get out of the car. Tiny figures began to gaze curiously at them from the row of hangars. The mechanic starting back on foot, the 4 people getting out of the car, the big plane waiting. With his revolver ready and aimed at Ribiera's bulk, Bell reached in the front of the car and turned off the switch, and the motor died abruptly. He put the key in his pocket. Just to get a minute or 2 extra start. Climb up in the plane, Paula. She obeyed and turned up at the top. I'll cover them until you're up. Bell laughed now, a genuine laugh for the first time in many years. Or many days, rather. We do work together. But he backed up the ladder. There was a stirring over by the hangars. The mechanic who had taxied the plane to the spot was a dwindling speck, no more than the third of the way across the field, but even from the distant hangars it could be seen that something was wrong. Close the door, Paula. He'd seated himself at the controls and scanned the instruments quickly. The machine was heavy, large and massive. The boat body between the tractable wheels added weight to the structure, and when Bell gave it the gun, it seemed to pick up speed with an irritating slowness, and to roll and lurch very heavily when it did begin to approach flying speed. The run was long before the tail came up. It was longer before the joltings lessened and the plane began to rise slowly, with a solid steadiness that only a large and heavily loaded plane can compass. Up and up. Bell was 300 feet high when he crossed the hangars and saw tiny faces staring up at him. Some of the small figures were pointing across the field. The big plane circled widely, gaining altitude, and Bell gazed down. Ribiera was gesticulating wildly, pointing upward to the soaring thing, shaking his fist at it, and making imperious, frantic motions of command. Bell took one quick glance all about the horizon, and toward the sea the sun shone down brilliantly upon the city. Inland, a broad white wall of advancing rain moved toward the coastline, and Bell smiled frostily, flinging the big ship into a dive, and swooped down upon Ribiera as a hawk might swoop at a chicken. Ribiera saw the monster thing bearing down savagely, its motors bellowing, its nose pointed directly at him. There's absolutely nothing more terrifying upon the earth than to see a plane diving upon you with deadly intent. A panic that throws back to non-human ancestors seizes upon a man. He feels the paralysis of those ancient anthropoids who were preyed upon by dying races of winged monsters in the past. That racial atavistic terror seizes upon him. Bell laughed, though it sounded more like a bark, as Riviera flung himself to the ground and screamed hoarsely when the plane seemed about to pounce upon him. The shrill timbre of the shriek cut through the roaring of the motors, even through the thick padding of the big plane's cabin walls, that reduced that roaring to a not intolerable growl. But the plane passed 10 feet or more above his head. It rose, climbed steeply, passing again above the now buzzing agitated hangars, and climbed above the hills behind the flying field, as some men went running, and others moved by swifter means toward the shaken, nerve-racked Riviera, on whose lips were flecks of foam. Bell looked far below and far behind him. The incredible greenness, the tropic verdure of the jungle which brings Rio all about, the many glitterings of sunlight upon grass, and upon the polished domes of sundry public buildings, and the multitudinous shimmerings of the tropic sun upon the bay. The deep dark shadow of the banking clouds drew a sharp line across the earth, and deep in that shadow lay the flying field, growing small and distant as the plane drew on. But specks raced across the wide expanse. In a peculiar, irrational fashion, those specks darted toward a nearly invisible speck, and encountered other specks darting away from that nearly invisible speck, and gradually all the specks were turned about and racing for that angular toy-block squares which were the hangars of the aeroplanes of the city of Rio de Janeiro. Little white things appeared from those hangars, planes being thrust out into the open air, while motes of men raced agitatedly about them. One of them was suddenly in motion, and it moved slowly and clumsily across the ground, and abruptly moved more swiftly. It seemed to float upward and swing about in midair. It came floating toward the amphibian, though apparently very nearly stationary against the sky. Another moved jerkily, and another. Just before the big plane dived into the wide white wall of falling water, the air behind it seemed to swarm with aircraft. In the cabin of the amphibian, of course, the bellowing of the motors outside was muffled to a certain degree. Paula clung to the seats and moved awkwardly up to the space behind Bell. She had just managed to seat herself when the falling sheet of water obliterated all the world. "Strap yourself in your seat," he said in her ear above the persistent tumult about. "Then you might adjust my safety belt. We'll be flying blind in this rain. I hope the propellers hold." She fumbled, first at the belt beside his upholstered chair, and only afterward adjusted her own. He sent a quick glance at her. "Shouldn't have done that. I can manage somehow." The plane lurched and tumbled wildly. He kicked rudder and jerked on the stick, watching the instrument board closely. In moments the wild gyrations ceased. "The beginning of this is going to be hectic. There will be lightning soon," he said evenly. Almost on his words, the gray mist out of the cabin windows seemed to flame. There was thunder even above the motors, but the faint, perceptible trembling of the whole plane under the impulse of its engines kept on. Bell kept his eyes on the bank and turn indicator, glancing now and again at the altimeter. "We've got to climb up to where the lightning is, too. We want to pass on the Serra de Caracuca with room to spare, or we'll crash on it." There were no noticeable change in the progress of the plane, of course. Rain was dashing against the windows of the cabin with an incredible velocity. Rain at 100 miles an hour acts more like hail than water anyhow, and Bell was trusting grimly to hope that the propellers were of steel, which will withstand even hail, and a hope that the blasts of the engine cowlings would keep the wiring free of water-made short circuits. But the air was bad beyond belief. At times the plane spun like thistledown in vast and venomous flood that crashed into windows with a vicious rattling. Lightning began and grew fiercer. It seemed at times as if the plane were whirling crazily in sheer incandescent flame. The swift air currents at the beginning of a tropic thunderstorm were here multiplied in trickiness and velocity by the hills of the Sierra de Caracoca, and Bell was flying blind as well. The safety belts were needed 50 times within 20 minutes, as the big ship was flung about by fierce blasts that sometimes blew even the rain upward for a time. And overall, as the amphibian spun madly and toppled crazily and fought for height, there was the terrific, incessant crashing of thunder, which was horribly close, and the crackling flares of lightning all about. "I'm going to take a chance," said Bell curtly above the uproar, with the windows seeming to look out upon the fires of hell. "I think we're high enough. The compass has gone crazy, but I'm going to risk it."
Again, there was no perceptible alteration in the motion of the ship, but he fought it steadily toward the west. And it seemed that he was actually passing beyond the fierce fringe of the storm, because the lightning became, well, not less frequent, but less continuous. And suddenly, in a blinding flare of light that made every separate raindrop look like a speck of molten metal, he saw another aeroplane. It was close, breathtakingly close. It came diving down out of nowhere and passed less than 20 yards before the nose of the amphibian. It glistened with wet and glittered unbearingly in the incredible brightness of the lightning. Every spot and speck and detail showed with almost ghastly distinctness. But it dived on past, its pilot rigid and tense and unseeing, plunging like a meteor straight downward. The golden iridescent mist of rain closed over its body, and then it was gone. 10 minutes later, Bell was driving onward through a gray obscurity, which was now no more than tinted pink by receding lightning flashes. The air was still uneven and treacherous, and the big plane hurtled downward hundreds of feet in wild descending gusts among the hills, and then was flung upward on invisible billows of air for other hundreds of feet. But it was less uncontrollable. There were periods of minutes when the safety belts didn't even come into use. And later still, half an hour perhaps, the steadiness of the air gave assurance that the plane was past the range of the Sierra de Caracoca and was headed inland. He drove on, watching his instruments and flying blind, but with gathering confidence in an ultimate escape from the swarm of aircraft Ribiera had sent aloft in the teeth of the storm to hunt for him. The motors hummed outside the padded cabin, and the girl beside him was very quiet, very still, very pale. "We want to get out of this before long," he said in her ear, "and then we can make out where we are, and especially begin to make some plans for ourselves." Her eyes turned to him, and there was a curious stiffness in her manner. It might have seemed reserved, but Bell recognized the symptoms of a woman whose self-control is hanging by a thread, and he smiled. "Hold on a while yet. I know you want to cry, but please, hold on a while yet. When we reach friends..." Her hands went to her throat, and he could feel the effort of will that kept her voice steady. "Friends? We have no friends. The Signor explained to me when I arrived at his house how there was no questions to be asked about my disappearance. My father's dead. The newspapers this morning said it was not known whether he killed himself or was assassinated. The Ribiera has given orders to his thralls. The newspapers of this afternoon will inform a horrified world that you and I together murdered by my father, that we might actually flee together with such of his riches that he'd gathered for me to take away. We're murderers, my friend. Cables and telegraph wires are reporting the news. The daughter of the Minister of War of the Republic of Brazil was assisted by her lover to murder her father. She's fled with him. Where are we to still find friends?" Bell stared for the fraction of an instant. One thought came to him and was checked. The trade doesn't exist anywhere. The trade wouldn't help. And murderers are always duly handed over when the government of the United States is requested politely to do so by another nation. Always. And so far as the whole civilized world was concerned, they were murderers. Even the employees of the flying field who were not subject to their master would swear to the strictly accurate story of their escape together. "It's just scandalous enough and horrible enough to be reprinted everywhere as news. You're right. We haven't any friends. We're up against it. And I believe that we'll have to hunt down and kill the master then. Then we'll be believed. And there are just two of us with what weapons we have in our pockets to attack. How many thousands of thralls do you suppose the master has by now?" And quite suddenly he laughed. Chapter 5, 6, 7. Chapter 7. If I can get my water bottle to close. Jeez. The sun was sinking slowly when the plane appeared above the valley. There was only jungle below. Jungle and a languid river, which now flowed sluggishly into a wide and shallow pool, in which downed trees formed a mass of substance neither land nor marsh nor river. The river now contracted to a narrow space and showed signs of haste, even foaming water, and then again flowed placidly onward,
sometimes even 100 yards in breadth. Shadows of the mountains to the west were creeping toward the opposite hill flanks, darkening the thick foliage and sending flocks of flying things home to their chosen roosts. The sound of the plane was a buzzing noise, which grew louder to a sharp drone as it seemed to increase in size, and became a dull, monotonous roar as it dipped toward the waters of the stream. It floated downward, very gently, and circled as if regarding a certain spot critically, and resumed its onward flight. Again it circled anxiously now, as if the time for alighting was short. It seemed to hesitate in midair and dived, circled upstream and came down the valley again. It sank and sank, lower and lower, until the white of its upper wings was hidden by the tall trees on either side. A jabiru stork saw it from downstream, solemnly squatting on 4 eggs which would eventually perpetuate the race. The jabiru was about 40 feet above the water and had a clear view of the stream, and so the stork squatted meditatively, with its long neck projecting above the edge of its nest. The plane dipped ever lower, its reflection vivid and complete upon the waveless stream below it. 10 feet above the water, 5 in swift ripples from the rush of air disturbed the unbroken reflections behind. It was almost like a silhouette against the mirrored appearance of the sunset sky. And then a clumsy seeming boat body touched water with a vast hissing sound and settled more and more heavily, while the speed of the plane checked markedly and its motors roared on senselessly. Then abruptly the plane checked and partly swung around. The jabiru half rose from its eggs. The motors were bellowing wildly again, as if tearing itself free. The plane sheared off from some invisible obstacle. One of the wingtip floats splashed water wildly, and with the motors thundering at their fullest speed, it went toward the shore with a dragging wing, like some wounded bird. It beached, and the jabiru had a sudden dense silence fall. A man climbed out of the boat-like body, and he walked to the bow and dropped to the shore. He peered under the upward slanting nose of the boat thing, and the jabiru, listening intently, heard words. And then quite suddenly and quite abruptly, and generally with the unostentatious efficiency with which nature manages such things in the tropics, night fell. It was dark within minutes. The noise of bells scrambling back onto the deck of the amphibian's hull could be heard inside the cabin. He opened the door and slipped down inside. There ought to be some lights. Ribiera did himself rather well as a rule. He struck a match. Paula's eyes shone in the match flame fixed upon his face, and he looked about, frowning. He found a switch and pressed it, and a dome light came into being. The cabin of the plane, from a place of darkness comparable to that of the jungle all about, became a suddenly cozy and comfortable place. Well? Bell hesitated and struck a deep breath. We're stuck. We must have struck a snag, or perhaps a rock just under the water. Half the bottoms of the hull's torn out. There's no hope of repair. If I hadn't given her the gun and beached her, we'd have sunk in midstream. Paula said nothing. Things are piling on us. In the morning I'll try to make a raft. We can't stay here indefinitely. I'll hunt for maps and we'll try to plan something out. But I'll admit this business worries me, the plane being smashed. He passed his hand harassedly over his forehead. To have escaped from Rio was something, but... To have escaped from Rio was something, but since Paula had told him Ribiera's plans, it was clearly but the most temporary of successes. Cabinet ministers are not so commonplace but the scandalous and Cabinet ministers are not so commonplace, but that the scandalous and horrifying crime that was imputed to Bell and Paula would be printed in every foreign country. Newspapers in Tokyo would include the supposed murder in their foreign news, and in Bush arrest in Constantinople it would merit a paragraph or two. Assuredly every South American country would discuss the matter editorially, even where the master's deputy didn't order it published far and wide. There'd be pictures of Bell and of Paula, labeled with an infamy. In every town of all Brazil their faces would be known, and those who were the master's slaves would hunt them desperately, and all honorable men would seek them for a crime. Even in America there'd be no safety for them. The trade doesn't exist officially, and as a member of the trade, You must get out of your own trouble. As an accused murderer, Belle would be arrested anywhere. As worse than a mere murderess, Paula, well, she was watching his face. This morning, you quoted Nil Desperandum. Belle ground his teeth and then managed to smile. If I looked like I needed you to say that, I deserve to be kicked. Let's look for something to eat and count up our resources. The thing to do is, when you fall down, bounce. He managed a nearly genuine grin, and then to his immense amazement, she sobbed suddenly and bent her head down and began to weep. He stared at her in stupefaction for an instant, and swore at himself for a moment. Her father. Half an hour later, he roused her as gently as he could. It was helplessness as much as anything else that had made him leave her alone, but people need to weep every now and again, and Paula certainly had excuse. Here's this cup of coffee. You must drink it. You haven't eaten anything all day, have you? That question had haunted him too. She'd been a prisoner in Ribiera's house for half an hour, possibly more, and Ribiera had in his possession and used a deadly devilish poison from some unknown noxious plant. Its victim took the poison unknowingly in a morsel of food, or a glass of water, or perhaps of wine, and for 2 weeks there was no sign of evil. And then the poison drove its victim swiftly mad, unless the antidote was obtained from Ribiera, and Ribiera administered the antidote with a further dose of poison. If Paula had eaten one scrap of food or drunk one drop of water while Ribiera's captive, she understood. She looked up suddenly and read the awful anxiety in his eyes. No, nothing. She caught her breath and steadied herself with an effort of the will. I understand. You tried not to let me fear, but I ate nothing, touched nothing. I have not that to fear at least. Drink this coffee, said Belle, smiling. Ribiera was a luxurious devil. There's canned stuff and so on in a locker. He was prepared for a forced landing everywhere. Flares and rockets will do us no good, but there was a pair of machetes and a sporting rifle with shells. We don't need to die for a bit anyway. Paula obediently took the coffee, and he watched her anxiously as she drank. Now some soup and the rest of this condensed stuff. I found some maps, and there's a radio receiving outfit if... Paula managed to smile. You want to know if I can endure listening to it? Yes, I shouldn't have given way just now, but I can endure anything. Belle still hesitated, regarding her soberly. I've heard that in Brazil, the conventions... She waited, looking at him with a large eye. I hoped to find this place, Moradores, where you said you had some relatives. I'd hoped to find it before dark, but before I landed I knew I'd missed it and couldn't hope to locate it tonight. I thought... Your thought that my reputation would be jeopardized and you were about to offer... Belle winced. Of course I don't mean to make a fool of myself, but some people... You forget what the newspapers will say of us, senor. You forget what news of us the cables have carried about the world. I think we'd better forget about the conventions. As the daughter of a Brazilian, that remark is heresy, but did you know my mother came from Maryland? Thank goodness. Then you can believe that I'm not thinking exclusively of you, and maybe we'll get somewhere. Paula put out her hand, and he grasped it firmly. Right, he said more cheerfully than ever before. Now, turn on the radio and see what news we get. Into the deep, dark jungle night, then, a strange incongruity was thrust. Tall trees loomed up toward the stars. A nameless little stream flowed placidly through the night and beached where impenetrable undergrowth crowded to the water's edge. A big amphibian flame lay slightly askew, while a light glowed brightly in its cabin. More, from that cabin there presently emerged the incredible sound of music, played in Rio for os gentes, of the distinctly upper strata of society, by a bored but beautifully trained orchestra. The jabiru stork heard it and craned its featherless neck to stare downward through beady eyes, but it wasn't frightened. Presently, instead of music, There was a man's voice booming in the disconnected sounds of human speech, and still the jabiru was unalarmed. Like most of the birds whose necks are bald, the jabiru was a useful scavenger, and so is tolerated in the haunts of men. And if man's gratitude is not enough for safety, the jabiru smells very, very badly, and no man hunts his tribe. Belle had been listening impatiently when a sudden whining, whistling noise broke into the program of very elevated music, played utterly without rest. The sound came from the speaker, of course. He frowned thoughtfully, while the whistling changed in timbre and became flute-like, and then changed again, nearly to its original pitch and tone. Bella wasn't listening. Her mind seemed very far away, and on subjects the reverse of pleasurable. "Listen, do you hear that whistle? It came on all at once." Paula waited as the whistling noise went on. It was vaguely discordant and monotonous. It was more than a little irritating. Again it changed timbre, going up to the shrillest of squealings, and back nearly to its original sound an instant later. Belle began to paw over the maps. The planes had been intended for a flight over the vast distances of Brazil. There was a small supply of condensed food, and a rifle and shells included in its equipment. Emergency landing fields are not exactly common in the back country of South America. Here's where we are. It must be where we are. No towns of any size nearby, no railroad, no port road, nothing. Nothing but jungle shown here. He frowned absorbedly over the problem. "What is it?" "Someone near. That's another radio receiver. An old-fashioned regenerative set. Sensitive enough and reliable enough, but a nuisance to everyone but its owner, except when it's a godsend as it is to us." The music ended, and a voice announced in laboriously classic Portuguese, with only a trace of the guttural intonation of the carioca, that the most important items of the day would be given. Paula paled a little, but listened without stirring. The voice read. The rustling of sheets of paper was abnormally loud. A bit of foreign news and a bit of local news, and then... She was deathly pale when the announcement of her father's death was finished, and she'd heard the official view of the police reported. Exactly what Ribeiro had told her it would be. When the voice added that a friend of the late Minister of War, Senor Ribeiro, had offered 20 contos for the capture of the fugitive pair who had escaped in an airplane stolen from him, she bit her lip until it almost bled. I know. It's as you said, but listen to that whistle." The news announcement ceased, and music began again, and the whistling abruptly died away. "I just found some coils that plug in to take the place of the longer wave ones. I'm going to try them. It's a hunch, and it's crazy, but..." There were sharp clickings. The radio receiver was one of those extraordinarily light and portable ones that are made for aircraft. In seconds, it was transformed into a shortwave receiver. Belle began to manipulate the dials feverishly. 2 minutes. 3, 4. The speaker began to whine softly and monotonously. "Regeneration on a carrier wave. It can't be far off that receiving set." Suddenly a voice spoke. It was blurred and guttural. Infinitely delicate adjustments cleared it up, and then... Belle listened eagerly, at first in triumph, then in amazement, and then in a grim satisfaction. Reports from Rio on a shortwave brand of radio frequencies were passing from Ribeira to some other place apparently inland. It was Ribeira's own voice, which quivered with rage as he reported Belle's escape. "I don't think that full details should be spoken even on beam wireless. I shall come to the fazenda tomorrow and communicate with the master directly. In the meantime, I've warned all sub-deputies in Brazil. I urge that all deputies be informed and instructed as the master may direct." Another voice replied that the master would be informed. In the meantime, the deputy for Brazil was notified. This list of bits of information chilled Belle's blood. This man of Venezuela had been denied the grace of the master by the deputy in Caracas. He would probably use the passwords and demand the grace of the master of sub-deputies in the state of Pará, to be seized and Caracas informed. The deputy in Colombia desired that the son of Colonel Garcia, upon a hunting party with friends in the Amazon basin, should be attached to the service of the master. His father had been so attached, and it was believed had smuggled a letter into the foreign mail warning his son. If possible, that letter should be intercepted, and from Paraguay, the deputy requested the family of Senor Gomez, visiting relatives in Rio, should be induced to regard the service of the master as desirable. The orders ceased abruptly. Ribiera acknowledged them, and the whining whistle cut off. And so Belle turned to Paula very grimly indeed. Pretty, isn't it? Apparently every nation on the continent has some devil like Ribiera in charge of the administration of this fiendish poison. Every republic has some fiend at work in it, and they're organized. Good heavens, they're organized. The master seems to supply them with a mixture of the poison and the antidote, and they report to him. Paula nodded. That was what my father had written down for you. Any man who can be lured to eat or drink anything these men have prepared is lost. He gains no pleasure as a drug might give. He is entrapped in a lifetime of fearful, awful service, knowing a moment's disobedience, a moment's reluctance to obey, whatever command they'll give will cause his madness. I'm trying to think what we can work out of this. Some things are clear. There's a radio receiving set nearby, which listen to those shortwave reports, within 5 or 6 miles at most. We're going to find that tomorrow, and there's a central point, a fazenda, where one may talk direct with the master, whoever and wherever he may be. And judging by Ribiera, my guess is that the master has the same hold upon them that they have on their underlings. Ribiera is too arrogant a scoundrel to make words. What's this word? Not underlings. I know what underlings means. How do I say this? Obsequious, obedient or attentive to an excessive or servile degree. So, Ribiera is too arrogant a scoundrel to make obsequious reports if he were not afraid to omit them. He was silent for a moment, thinking, and then he said abruptly, Try to get some sleep if you can. That pistol of Ribiera's. You have it handy? Keep it where you can reach it in the dark. I'm going to keep watch. Paula settled herself comfortably and looked strangely across the dimly lit little cabin at him. You must excuse me. I apparently have a case of the hiccups. Okay. Sorry, that's an old trick I learned to get rid of hiccups. If it wasn't dreadfully clear, you hold your breath for a bit, and then you just take a couple slow breaths in and out. Very metered, very measured. You keep an eye on it, and it makes your diaphragm less upset with you. Purportedly, anyway. Paula settled herself comfortably and looked queerly across the dimly lit little cabin at him. My friend, please do not reassure me. I have the courage of endurance at least, and I don't fear you. It seemed to Belle, listening in the darkness that fell when he turned off the switch, that she stayed awake for a long time, but when she did sleep, she slept heavily. Belle had a raft of canes afloat beside the amphibian when she waked. He was sweat-streaked and bitten by many insects. He was tired and his clothes were rags, but the raft was nearly 20 feet long. It would easily float 2 persons and what small supplies the plane carried, and could be handled by a long pole. Hello, he said cheerfully when she climbed on top of the waterlogged hull of the plane. We're nearly ready to start off. I'm sorry I can't advise you to try to refresh yourself in the river. There are some fish in it that are fiends. One of them took a slice out of the side of my hand. Piranhas? You should have known. Piranhas are small freshwater fish of the Brazilian rivers, never more than 1.5 feet long, which prove the existence of a devil. Where they swarm in schools, they will tear every morsel of flesh from a swimmer's body as he struggles to reach shore, and leave a clean, stripped skeleton of a mule or horse if an animal should essay to swim a stream. I'll ask the next time. I'd plan to swim, but if you'll fix coffee while I finish up this raft, we'll get going. I don't think we're far from some place or another. I heard what sounded suspiciously like a motorboat about dawn. She looked at him anxiously. Of course, if the boat belonged to whoever listened in on the Rio broadcast and the shortwave news, he won't be especially friendly, though he should be glad to see us. I've been studying the map, and I have a rather hopeful idea. Let's have some coffee. He grinned as long as she was in sight, and when he went into the cabin of the plane, he seemed more cheerful still. But the idea of floating down this nameless little jungle stream upon a raft of canes was not one that he would have chosen. It was forced upon him. To travel through the jungle itself was next to impossible with just about anyone, especially as they were dressed for city streets and not at all for battling through the jungle. But the actual sorry, I lost my place, and I was trying to improvise. Sooner or later they had to abandon it. Though the moment they did desert it, they would be encountering not only the impersonal menace of the jungle, but the actual enmity of all the human race. This raft was really the only possibility. It floated smoothly enough when they started off, with Bell working inexpertly with his long pole to keep it midstream. He was, of course, acutely apprehensive. In a country like this, a rapid could be expected anywhere. The jungle life loomed high above their heads on either side, and the life of the jungle went on undisturbed by their passage. Monkeys gaped at them and exchanged undoubtedly witty comments upon their appearance. Birds flew overhead with raucous and most unpleasant cries. Toucans, in particular, made a rather discordant din. Once they disturbed a tiny herd of peccaries drinking, which regarded them pugnaciously and trotted sturdily out of sight as they came abreast. But for 1 mile, for 2, the stream flowed smoothly. A third, and Paula pointed in the head in the distance. A dugout projected partly from the shoreline. Bell wielded his long pole cautiously now, and drew ever closer and ever closer to the stream bank. Paula pointed again. There was even a small dock, luxury unthinkable in these wilds. The raft touched bottom, and suddenly, from somewhere out of sight, there came a horrible and bestial sound. It was a scream of bloodlust, of madness, of overpowering and unspeakable rage. Following it came cackling laughter. Paula went pale. The fazenda of the sub-deputy who was listening in on Ribiera last night. It sounds as if someone were very much amused. Some poor devil. Paula shuddered. I'm going ashore. There's nothing else to do. Alright, I think that's a pretty good cliffhanger to end on. And, sorry about that. I accidentally stopped the recording. Anyway, to make it long and short, that's a pretty good cliffhanger to end on. And my insides are angry with me. So, and I think my throat's getting a little murgurger as well, along with the rest of my insides. So, I want to call it an evening. Thanks for tuning in to Paper Cuts. Tune in next week if you want to hear more about the plight of our intrepid hero against the drug of madness inducement. And this has been Paper Cuts. I hope it didn't sting.